Your attention. Good evening. They're awake. How's everybody tonight? That good? All right, let me see a show of hands. Scale of 1 to 10. How are we doing? Okay. All right. Okay. On average, not bad. On average, not bad. Very good. Well, welcome. I'm Carl Asplund. I'm the Associate Director of the Honors Program, and I have the distinct pleasure to welcome you here tonight for what will be a very interesting evening. It is the 62nd Honors Colloquium, Education Behind the Curtains. And it's going to be great to hear from our speakers today, Jennifer Berkshire and Jack Schneider, who are going to talk to us about what is public, about public education. But before we begin, a few housekeeping details. The exits are in the back and on both sides of the stage. Bathrooms are in the foyer. And please refrain from photos or video today. And as a matter of fact, this might be a good moment to silence your cell phones. I will now give you a moment to do that. Thank you. And so let's put the devices away and pay full attention to our guests, who we are very privileged to have here this evening. Now, if for some reason you do need to leave during the event, please be careful. Those doors do not close quietly, so guide them in. And please refrain from speaking until you're out of the building. It's a dint of the acoustics here that everything said out there can actually be heard up here. Don't ask me why. However, now I would like to welcome Maya Hill, or as she is otherwise known, the marvelous, fabulous, wonderful Maya Hill, to join me for the land acknowledgement. Maya, please join us. Maya is a member of the Narragansett tribe, and it gives me great pleasure to read to her and to you the land acknowledgement statement. Now, the University of Rhode Island occupies the traditional stomping ground of the Narragansett Nation and the Niantic people. We honor and respect the enduring and continuing relationship between the Indigenous people and this land by teaching and learning more about their history and present-day communities, and by becoming stewards of the land we too inhabit. Maya, please.
Thank you. Kawankamash, Kanupiao. Hello and welcome. My name is Maya Hill. I don't know about the fabulous and marvelous. I didn't think he was really going to do all of that. I am a member of the Narragansett tribe. I am also a veteran of the Army. I have 2 children who are serving. One is serving currently in the Air Force, and I have a veteran son, and I also have a freeloader who is still living on my couch. He's 13, so I guess he's allowed to do that. He's still a freeloader. I would like to thank Katantuit, God, for the gift of endurance, perseverance, and His grace and mercy for all of us. I believe the speakers this evening will emphasize the vital importance of preserving and strengthening our public school systems, a cause deeply tied to our shared vision for just an equitable future. Each time I'm given the opportunity to speak, I accept it with the hope that what is shared will not only be heard, but will also inspire others to seek a deeper understanding and, in turn, share that knowledge within their own communities. It is through this ongoing exchange, rooted in truth and inquiry, that a more meaningful conversation and ultimately transformative change can occur. Such change must be grounded in historical truth, not filtered narratives that obscure realities of our past, nor distortions designed to serve selective agendas. History is not merely a record. It is our most powerful tool for learning, for driving real progress, and for fostering genuine solidarity. As we gather here today on Turtle Island, as people whose lives are intertwined on this land, while we are often reminded that this country was founded on promises of freedom, we must also recognize that this promise was denied to many, especially those whose labor and sacrifice made the aspirations of others possible. The injustices endured were not only immense, but have too often been erased or retold to serve narratives that do not reflect our own truths. Still, we stand in a moment where we can choose to lead with integrity. We have the capacity to create lasting change rooted in truth, in growth, and in justice. If we lead by example, we can strengthen our collective future and ensure the voices of those historically silenced are not only heard, but uplifted. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya, for those valuable words that should be a guidance to us all. Now, before I leave the stage, I want to tell you a little bit about the honors program and events that we are involved in here so that you can take full advantage of those. And I want to point out that this colloquium really does what honors programs do and what our program does best. We examine the major issues of our time at a timely moment. And what could be more timely right now than a colloquium on education? This colloquium also embodies the overall mission of honors education at URI, which is to prepare our students to navigate a daunting world as creative thinkers, creating in their disciplines and in their communities and in their personal lives long after they have left here. Now, we have a few special events that are also for our students as well as members of the public, and these also come under the heading of that same guidance. We see, for example, that at the URI Theater, they now have a show opening on October 17th, Pride and Prejudice, which you may be familiar with, but this is a new take on the 200-year-old story of the Bennets, Mr. Darcy and that whole clan. Apparently, this is not your grandmother's Austen, and I would recommend it. And as a matter of fact, we recommend it so heavily that if any of you would like to buy a ticket for the October 19th event, which is a post-matinee, there's a 2 p.m. show on Sunday the 19th of October, where we will host a discussion about the play and its connection to the colloquium theme. If you would care to come to the honors program office or email us a copy of a single ticket you have bought to that performance, we will give you one for free. But we have only 10 to give away. So rush now. You can pick up your phones now to do that. I will forgive you if you pull out your phone now to buy a ticket. But please, run up to me on the quad. Show me your ticket. I will give you one right there. Now, secondly, we have the Art and Art History Department having opened an art exhibit on various places on the campus, among others in Libet Hall. These are very exciting and dynamic artworks, which I would recommend you come and take a look at. And the Hera Gallery has worked with us in the past, and now they are hosting a banned books marathon on October 11th or 12th. So if there are books that you have been trying to get at your library and you cannot find, they will probably be read there in a 24-hour event. I would recommend you come there or even come there to read. I will be reading overnight from 1984. So if you want to drop by at 3 a.m., you'll find me there with Orwell. I'm not kidding. Now, producing a series of this scope requires 1 or 2 years of planning and a lot of campus partners. So I would like to thank a few people. The colloquium coordinators, Lazaro Camacho Jr. and Daniel Kelly are here in the front row from the College of Education. I want to thank our sponsors for this year's program, and they're listed on the program, by the way. And I would like to give a special thanks to President Parlange and his office and our Provost Wolf and her office, both of whom are sustaining sponsors of the event. So if we could have a little applause for all of the above. And of course, I wouldn't be doing my job properly if I did not solicit support. Please consider supporting the program. You see the events we organize. You hear our manifesto. and any donations that you would care to send over through that QR code, large or small, there's no such thing as a too small donation. We'll fund things like student projects, travel and social events, experiential learning experience, and the cost of taking students out on Narragansett Bay for research, among other things. So, as I go, let me invite you to join us next week for Heather Schotten, who will speak to us about becoming an Indigenous serving institution. And so now I would like to welcome Dan Kelly to the stage to formally introduce tonight's speakers. And he is one of the organizers of the Colloquium and an associate teaching professor in the College of Education. Dan, the show is yours. Thank you all. Have a good evening.
All right, good evening, everybody. Before we get started, students, if you did not check in, if you could please take a moment to get that QR code, make sure we've got your attendance taken care of. I don't see too many phones out, so I think most of you got it taken care of when you came in. Excellent. So this week's Colloquium explores the theme, Teaching in Contentious Times. Across the nation, schools have become flashpoints in broader cultural and political debates. From battles over curriculum and book bans, to disputes about whose voices and histories belong in classrooms, educators find themselves at the center of urgent national conversations. Tonight's discussion will help us step back from the headlines to ask how these conflicts shape the work of teachers, how they affect students, and how we can protect the role of public education in a sustaining democracy. So it is my honor to introduce our speakers, Dr. Jennifer Berkshire and Dr. Jack Schneider. Jennifer Berkshire is a journalist and an educator whose work examines the intersection of education and politics. A frequent contributor to The Nation, The New Republic, The Baffler, and The New York Times, she teaches in Yale University's Education Studies program, as well as Boston College's Prison Education program. Her course, The Politics of Public Education, explores the enduring conflicts over how, where, by whom, and for what purpose American children are educated. Jack Schneider is a scholar, teacher, writer, and activist who serves as the Dwight W. Allen Distinguished Professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he leads the Beyond Test Scores project. His research examines how educators, policymakers, and the public decide what counts as truth, effectiveness, and importance in education, and how those views can diverge from the lived realities of schools and communities. He also writes frequently for the New York Times, The Nation, and The Atlantic, often reminding readers that education reform is far more complex than its champions suggest. Together, Dr. Berkshire and Dr. Schneider are co-authors of A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door and The Education Wars, A Citizen's Guide and Defense Manual. They are also co-hosts of the acclaimed podcast, Have You Heard?, which brings thoughtful, accessible conversations about education policy and practice to audiences nationwide. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jennifer Berkshire and Dr. Jack Schneider to URI.
Well, thank you so much for that nice introduction. And Jack and I spent a pretty delightful afternoon wandering around this campus where we had never been before. And what a great place.
We found the little arboretum area. I stopped and smelled the roses. That was pretty nice.
Yeah.
We found a cafe, but it closes at 4 o'clock.
So we're going to start off tonight with a story that requires you to leave this beautiful campus, and we want you to accompany us to Somerville, Massachusetts. And for those of you who don't know Greater Boston, Somerville is just a couple miles away from Greater Boston. Its claim to fame is that it is the most densely populated community in all of New England. And we're going to go back a few weeks. It's a beautiful September day. It's the start of the school year. And an education professor, an education historian to be precise, is out and about. He lives across the street from a school, and he happens to see a young man on his way to the first day of school, struggling beneath his giant backpack. And what happens next?
I thought you were going to tell the story. It wasn't a backpack. It was like a satchel that he had, that he was tasked with carrying. And he wasn't a young man. He was like 7, maybe. Well, I guess he's a young man, very young. And he was walking to school, and it was clear that he was walking to the school that my daughter attended, the school across from which we live. And it was also clear that his parents had taken the assignment from the teacher to bring in supplies really seriously, because there were like 12 boxes of tissues and 3 cartons of wipes and a bunch of markers, and he could barely lift this thing. And so I hadn't yet had my shoulder surgery, so I was two-handed, and I said, "Are you going to the Kennedy School?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "I'm going to help you out with that." And so he said, "Oh, thanks, mister." And so we started walking to school, and I was asking, "Who's your teacher this year?" So, "Oh, I have, Miss Ward is my teacher." I said, "Oh, that's great. My daughter had Miss Ward." "And who'd you have for second?" We were talking about who we had for second grade, first grade. Thought we were really developing a rapport here. This kid was really going to be ready for my message about how important his school is and how great it is that he goes to school in a really diverse community like ours. And as we got closer to school, I said, "All right, this is where I'm going to leave you. And I just want you to know, like, someday you're going to get to go to Somerville High School. My daughter goes there." And he looked at me and he said, "I'm not going to Somerville High School, mister." And I said, "Why not?" He said, "Oh, my parents are going to send me to a better school than that." Now, we live in a community where our test scores, like in so many diverse communities, are not as high as in communities with, let's say, young people with more tailwinds behind them on their way into school. And one of the things that I always sell about our community and the public schools that we've got there is that everybody goes to school together and ends up treating each other in a way that I find really inspiring. When I walk inside the halls of that school, I see young people treat each other the way I wish we all treated each other in our society. My daughter runs track in addition to playing soccer, and her track coach recently said to me that whenever he's having a bad day, he goes to the school because he likes watching how kids treat each other there. And so I said something along these lines to this kid, and he said, "I don't know. I don't think my parents are interested in all that." So, I think that this puts us in this moment where, as was shared in the introduction, we're facing so many challenges to public education. There are so many threats to the ability to teach history in an honest way, to teach the literature that we want to teach, to engage in debate and dialogue. And I think under all that, there's this really important problem that we haven't recognized and that is pervasive in education and that is illustrated in that story, which is that I think we've lost the thread here with regard to what our schools really do.
And I really like that story, one, because I just love the idea of Jack engaging this 7-year-old, and then the 7-year-old being kind of like, we're not, nobody really cares.
Yeah, he was sort of old-timey too.
Yeah.
Like, "No thanks, Mac."
But I also thought that in many ways it kind of stands in for the way that our vision of what schools do has shrunk over time. And so as I mentioned, Jack is an education historian, and so you can ask him about any period of education history, and he'll be able to tell you about this thing.
You're going to give them ideas. The Q&A is going to be like pub quiz.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I was curious, if we took that encounter and we put it back in time, we climbed into our time machine.
You put me on horseback.
Put you on a horseback,
Yeah.
and you're talking to a kid in the earliest days of public education in this country,
Right.
like early in the Republic. How did he think? How might he have thought
Well, he wouldn't have had any Kleenex, first of all. Right?
That's right, the Kleenex and the wipes.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about what
Yeah.
I get the feeling that maybe there was a different sense of what schools were for and why we needed them.
Right, right. So I had the pleasure of visiting a class earlier today, and one of the things that we were talking about in that class is the idea that education is a way to get ahead, right? So the exercise that we put ourselves through, more or less, was like stop and think for a minute about why you're here. Why are you here at URI? You're here at a great public institution of higher learning. You have access to courses that your forebears couldn't have even dreamed up, right? You have opportunities to study things that most people in the history of the world wouldn't have had the opportunity to study. And however curious you are, my guess is that what would be top of mind for you is, I'm here because I want to get a job, right? I'm here because that's how you get ahead in our society. And that wouldn't have been the case in 1820 or 1720, or in Massachusetts, we can go all the way back to the 1600s. And I think at the core here is this question of, why do we pay for public education with our tax dollars? Right? Why did people decide to do that once upon a time? It wasn't as a subsidy to people in the community with children. It was because there was a view that we would get something out of it. And so the question then is, what did people think they would get out of public education? And the first thing that I think we can talk about is this idea of democratic equality. And it's something that, again, we've lost the thread of when we're talking about what school is good for, and particularly when we're talking about public education, right? The education that we taxpayers subsidize or pay for entirely, if we're talking about K-12 education. What are we getting out of that? And the original vision was what some scholars refer to as democratic equality, this idea that if we're going to live in a republic, if everybody's going to have the opportunity to do something like have a say at a town meeting, or if the, albeit not total population of the period, is going to have the opportunity to vote, right? What's going to qualify those people to be full-fledged members of a democratic society? How are we going to sustain ourselves? And the question became more nuanced and more interesting, I think, across time, as people wrestled with questions about things like cultural, linguistic, and ethnic diversity. Right? Benjamin Franklin was on record talking about the threat to America posed by German speakers in Pennsylvania. Right? So these kinds of concerns about what makes us Americans and how we'll stay together are as old as the Republic, older even. And the idea that public education would give people common footing, would bring people together and give them common cause together, is the oldest purpose of public education. And the little character in my neighborhood who was walking to school that day just simply didn't see it, and it's not his fault, right? None of us see it. I don't think any of us go to school any day of the year and think, I'm a part of something. I'm a part of a project of building a democracy. I'm a part of a solidarity project that puts me in common cause with people from all different walks of life. And that is exactly what the core aim of public education would have been at the founding. In fact, our public schools were not called public schools when they were first created by folks like Horace Mann in Massachusetts or Henry Barnard nearby in Connecticut. They were called common schools, right? Because the idea was that people would go to school together and that would form the basis for lasting, trusting relationships, again, in a young, emerging democratic republic.
Okay, so we've got this vision of democratic equality, but I think probably the rationale that most of us are more familiar with is both this idea of social mobility you were talking about, but also the idea that schools are what power our economy. Think about any time that if you've ever had the occasion to hear a politician make the case for why we have public schools, or if you live in a community where people have been asked to pay more for the local schools, there's a referendum happening, you will often hear really a purely economic case, right? That if we train kids up through the schools and that's how they get jobs, that's going to be better for all of us because it delivers economic gains both to us as a community, but also nationally, when you hear about them talking about our ability to compete internationally. So where does that kind of thinking
Yeah. So I think we can talk about three aims in public education, right? Democratic equality, social mobility, which you talked about, right? That's getting ahead. And then social efficiency, this idea that we'll sort people for their slots in society and particularly in our economy. And we've heard a lot about the latter two over the past 40 or 50 years. Well, most of you in the audience haven't heard a lot of anything for 40 or 50 years. But for all of your lifetimes, what you've heard is leaders getting up and talking about how education is the key to your futures and the key to economic prosperity for America as a nation. And we haven't heard anything about the democratic equality, and nor have we heard anybody really talking or giving voice to concerns about other things in public education that make it public, like, for instance, that we make decisions through democratically elected school boards. Right? That's an element of public education that we have begun to take for granted so severely that turnout in school board elections is often barely in the double digits. Or, for instance, the transparency that is required in a public system. Or, if we're going to talk about other things that make public education public, I think we should also talk about accountability, right? Now, I don't mean test-based accountability. I think that's a pretty sorry version of public accountability. But the public schools belong to us. They belong to us by virtue of the fact that they are public. That's one of the defining features of our public education system. And it's one of the reasons why I think we should be really concerned about accountability systems that are algorithmic in nature, right? Where the State Department of Education will simply take test scores, graduation rates, attendance rates, put them into a formula, and then issue this algorithmic determination about how a school is doing, rather than allowing people to have a kind of direct judgment on schools. And once more, this is because we've lost a sense of what is public about public education. I think this has really serious consequences for us in terms of the threats that public education is facing right now.
So we called this talk What's Public About Public Education, but there was actually a really sort of ominous subtitle that Dan and his colleagues chose to leave off of the poster, and that was basically, will it still exist in 2028?
It was too dark.
It was too dark. And so we really were not being hyperbolic. And we're going to sort of fast forward a little bit here and then go back and talk about sort of where did things go wrong. And so I want you all to sort of put your consumer hats on and think about the way that you buy other stuff right now. That when you need something, maybe you go to Amazon and you click on the thing, maybe you read the reviews and hope that all the reviews aren't fake. And back in 2020, Jack and I released a book called A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door. And the last chapter is called Education a la carte. And at the time, we thought we were being sort of, like almost science fiction-y.
Really provocative.
And offering up a kind of Black Mirror image of how things, like if we continued on our current path, this is how things could look. And not only did the chapter end up being really prescient, but I think we understated what it looks like when states begin to shift to a purely consumer vision of school. So some of you, I'm sure you've been talking in your classes about school vouchers, and this is the idea that the state is going to give money directly to parents, and parents might use that money to pay for private school tuition, usually religious school tuition. But the vision that we're now starting to see in places like Arizona and Florida takes that consumer vision and advances it even further. And so instead of saying, okay, parent, you can use this money to pay for tuition at a school, now the idea is that it's going to be up to the parent to determine what education is, period. And that maybe they can use that money to then purchase things on an Amazon-like exchange. So that's the vision in Florida, for example, so that when you, the money that previously might have gone to your school district, instead now it's going to go to an individual parent. And then they decide what they want to use it for. So maybe it's a homeschooling curriculum. Maybe it's a series of products, like you're really interested in cooking, and so your parent purchases for you a subscription-based home cooking service. And the idea is that we're radically shifting the definition of not just what schools do, but what school is and who gets to decide. And so that vision of publicness, forget about the democratic equality, now it's basically a vision that's pretty much like Amazon, but for school.
Yeah, I think a few other examples might be illustrative for those who don't track this stuff carefully. So in Arizona, for instance, there is a NEO voucher that is referred to as the education debit card. And so if you choose this option in Arizona, you withdraw your child from the public schools, you can then receive a debit card in the mail that comes preloaded with the state funds that would have gone to your child's school and that can instead be expended basically however you like. Now, they don't say however you like in the statutory language behind the education debit card, but they have built in zero record keeping and zero accountability. So what's the message being sent by the design of the policy, right? If you can spend this anywhere without any repercussions, the message being sent is that these tax dollars are for you to spend at your whim and at your will. Now, that may not sound like a problem. Some of you may be thinking, how do I get one of these education debit cards, right? Like, what are the requirements for residency in Arizona? Maybe I qualify here. But again, we need to start thinking about what this means for the public good rather than simply the private good, right? Certainly it would be nice to end up with $6,000 of free cash to spend on whatever you want each month. But that comes at the expense of fully funded schools, right? That comes at the expense of participating in a democratic system. And when we look around at our society and we perhaps feel some anxiety about where we find ourselves with regard to this political moment, right? With regard to the divisions that are in our society and that are rampant across our politics, I think it's important to ask about the role that something like schooling plays in bringing people together and in allowing them to practice this work of making decisions together. I think there are other cases that we could point to as well where we would have questions about the public good being undermined, particularly with regard to some of the curricular products that can be purchased with voucher funds in states like Florida or Arizona, or in fact, any number of states that have gone down this path. And I'm thinking of some where flat earth curricula are taught, right? I think you have an example of somebody posting on a chat board and asking, anybody got any good flat earth curricula out there for us? So I think it's really important to be connecting some of these dots between the way that we think about the purpose and value of education and the kinds of policies that we see at this moment that are undermining public education. We haven't even talked about things like book banning, right?
We're going to get to that.
Yeah.
But first, so I need your help understanding how we got here. Because when you think about it, like, you know, we're very used to thinking in a consumery way about almost everything else in our culture. And yet, schools, public education has stood apart from that. And so I think in many ways, we're just now reaching a point where we're very much being encouraged to think about education the way that we think about everything else. You often use the analogy of buying a sandwich, but it's really purchasing anything.
Yeah.
So how did we end up here so that those other purposes of education that you were describing, the vision of democratic equality, that kind of community identity, how did we end up in a place where all that seems to have been forgotten? And now I think to a lot of people it seems very rational, even appealing, that you would customize an education for your child purchasing a variety of products online.
Yeah, the thing I'm thinking about is Johan Niem's article about road crews. So we've got a friend, a historian, Johann Neem, who teaches at Western Washington University, and he wrote this weird piece in a strange outlet about road construction in the early Republic.
You're really selling it.
I know, everybody's going to run right out and find this. And road construction in the early Republic was a community affair. Basically, everybody had to chip in. There was no municipal road maintenance crew, right? There was no town utility responsible for roads. It was something that everybody recognized they had to do together. And the fact that people had to do it together meant that people really understood roads as a public good, right? Because they made those roads. They had contributed their literal sweat, and hopefully not any blood or tears, to the construction of those roads. And I think that's instructive about education, because that actually is very much how education governance once looked. Education governance was very much a case of direct democracy, where people would come together and make decisions at town meetings about matters like hiring teachers, or about matters like curriculum, or even advancing students. I mentioned accountability a little bit earlier. Even accountability was a local affair where towns would make decisions about how schools were doing based upon their interviews of students, demonstrations of student work, visits to classrooms. And these are ordinary members of the community, right? Not bureaucrats, not members of the State Department of Education. And I'm not suggesting that all tasks should be devolved to the local level, but I think one of the reasons we get where we are right now is because of the problem of scale, right? The problem of scale means that we are trying to do education so massively that we actually do really need a large infrastructure that includes a number of deeply bureaucratic elements. So scale is a problem there. Another issue that's related to this, and that I don't think is a problem, I think it's a good thing, is professionalization, right? We want professionals to be teaching. We want professionals to be making decisions. But it means that we have become much less involved in the daily operation of schools. And then I think the third thing, and something that I have referred to a couple times, is just the role played by the state, right? The more that the state governs our schools, the less we have to do this for ourselves. So I think one way of answering this is we step back and we see we don't do a whole lot with regard to our schools, right? We drop our kids off, and that feels a lot like the way we engage with supermarkets or McDonald's or Walmart or any other provider of a good or service. Right? It's very easy to begin seeing ourselves not as stakeholders in a community institution, but rather as customers who are due a kind of service in return for our patronage. That's one of the problems that is a part of an explanation here. But I think a big part of this is the fact, and this is a success story, is the fact that education has been actually really good at helping people get ahead in our society, right? If we have a choice between saying, well, we're going to have education as one of the key levers for social mobility in our society. It's going to let people get ahead, but it's going to come at a severe cost. It's going to make people forget about the aim of democratic equality. It's going to make people forget that we're all in this together. It's going to encourage them to think of themselves as consumers who are pitted against each other in order to rise to the top via something like a meritocracy. Right? If we had that as one choice, and as the other choice, no social mobility whatsoever, inherited ranks and titles, right? I think we would all take schools as mechanisms of social mobility, even with all of the consequences there. And so I think it's a good story. It's a good story to talk about how schools have allowed people to get ahead who wouldn't have had an opportunity to get ahead in, say, a feudal society. I think we should worry about the cordoning off of avenues of opportunity to get ahead through school. And that is one of the threats that we're currently facing, right? Public schools don't just do all of these high-minded things that I was talking about earlier about advancing our collective interests and supporting our democracy. They also provide very real, tangible benefits to everyone. The fact that we do it publicly means that everybody gets the same thing. And so if then we're willing to pay the cost that comes with social mobility and say that we're going to undermine the democratic equality aim, we then need to be thinking about how do we shore that up, because the consumer mentality in education is absolutely something that has been growing along with the success of education in moving people along. People have come to expect that if they earn a particular degree, that particular kinds of doors will open.
And then when, in addition to that sort of consumer mentality, then you also have to think about where we are right now in terms of our politics. And that we're at a moment where we are very divided, and it just makes it makes it that much harder to do anything that requires us to work together around a shared goal. So you mentioned book banning, for example. And in some ways, like, we don't typically think about it this way, but like put your consumer hat back on and think about what parents are actually saying, when they're protesting the use of a particular book. Well, one thing they're saying is that, like, I want to be able to exert my individual influence over what's taught in this school, right? It's very much the same logic that we were just talking about with the idea that you would customize the education for your child by purchasing a variety of products online. One of the, because I spend so much time hanging around with education historians, one of the things that I've learned is that we have been fighting about these same issues decade after decade after decade. And this whole question about who gets to decide is so key. And so you go back 100 years, and now, like, it would seem fairly shocking to a lot of you if you read about the lengths that communities would go to make sure that kids were going to school, right? That it wasn't just that we passed compulsory education laws where they said, like, okay, kid, you're going to school. There was basically like a police component to make sure that kids were showing up. And so you think about, like, who has the power, right? Is it the state, meaning the government operating through the school, or is it the parent? And we see basically 100-year-long sparring match over that question. And any time we see an effort to expand civil rights, it's going to be during Brown versus Board and the battle over desegregation. It could be over the expansion of gay rights in the 1980s and 90s. And right now, it is the issue of whether trans kids should get to have any rights at all. But whenever we're fighting about the expansion of civil rights, it's also a moment when you see that endless back and forth between parents and the people in charge. And right now, we're at a moment where, in part because of the long fallout from the pandemic, our pendulum has swung really far towards shifting the balance in favor of parents. Over the summer, there was a big Supreme Court case that probably a lot of you didn't even hear about. It was brought by some parents in a Maryland school district who were opposed to the mandatory assigning of books with LGBTQ themes. And the parents said, we feel like forcing our kids to read this is undercutting our ability to raise our kids according to our religion. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, we agree with you. And moreover, we think that parents should be able to opt their kids out of anything in a public school setting that potentially undermines their freedom of religion, and specifically their ability to raise kids in their religion. And in addition to giving parents that right to opt out, we think that parents should be able to sue their school districts if and when they feel that this is not happening. And so when you look at that bigger picture and what we're fighting about, you can see that, in fact, it's the latest installment of one of the oldest education battles in the land, which is who gets to decide?
Yeah, in the class that I visited earlier today, we talked a little bit about why culture war so often makes its way into the schools. And the short version of that is young people are both symbolic and actual minors who we treat as a vulnerable population in our society. And moreover, inside the school, the doors are closed and the adults don't come into the building with them. So schools are easy institutions to tell stories about. And so if we are engaged in a politics in which we are trying to show, whatever our particular party affiliation, we are trying to show that the other side is threatening our very way of life, then showing that that other side is doing things inside the schools that threaten our way of life is an important and constant element in culture war. And so one of the reasons that we see things like book bans or the so-called parental rights movement is that our political battles outside of schools have come pouring into our schools. Now that's not new, as you were just saying, Jennifer, but what is new is the fact that I don't think that we have the same kind of infrastructure in terms of the way we conceive of schools, the kind of intellectual infrastructure for thinking about schools that we once had, right? If we had a stronger sense of public schools as being a part of the bedrock of our democracy, if we had a sharper sense of the role that public schools play in advancing democratic equality or our mutual solidarity, then I think that we would be able to count on schools bouncing back from this like they have during every previous culture war. But if we view schools as institutions that should be responsive to us as if we are consumers rather than citizens, right? And they should be meeting our particular needs and catering to our particular desires, then I think it's easy for all of us to begin imagining washing our hands of this really messy problem, which is how do we live alongside one another and how do we educate our children alongside one another, right? Because it is a heck of a lot easier to just go our separate ways. And one of the reasons why public schools originally were often better funded than private academies was that the founders of the common schools recognized that they had a major hurdle to overcome, right? That people who already could afford to school their children were sending their children to schools that had particular, and it was often religious, but particular ideological aims. Now, if you're going to pull those people out of those schools, which are more suited to their family values, right, to the value system that is guiding the raising of these children, if you're going to convince them to pull those kids out of their schools and put them into a school where ostensibly everybody will feel equal membership, you're going to have to sell them on something. And the thing that the common school founders sold them on was these schools are better, right? And that may be surprising to some of the young people in the audience, right? The idea was that the public schools would be better. They would be better funded. They would be better equipped. They would have better school facilities. That teachers would be better trained. In fact, being trained at all in the 18th or 19th century was rare. They would have better access to curriculum and resources. And this is another part of our inability to track the story of what's public about public education, because I think some of us in this room have probably begun to associate the word public with less than, right? That if you get public services for something, that's because you couldn't afford the real deal, as opposed to this richer and actually more historic sense of what public means, which is actually that it truly meets the needs of everybody.
So what are we going to do? Because I often get the feeling when, you and I spend a lot of time talking about this, and, sometimes I just really feel like we're like we represent the land that time forgot, right? that ship has sailed. And I'll give you an example. I've been telling my students about how when I was in 5th grade, I was part of a citywide desegregation experiment where for 2 years they moved all the kids around in order to shuffle the neighborhoods. And the whole idea was that they thought we needed to spend at least 2 years in our new school with our new classmates because that's how long it took to make friends. And the goal was that they wanted us to make friends of different races. And when I tell my college students that story today, they just look at me like, that's just bonkers. Like, who would do that anymore? The idea of, telling parents that they have to do anything seems more and more remote, but particularly for a vague goal, like we just want the kids to make friends who don't look like them. And so sometimes I just feel like, Jack, is it just too late? Has the horse left the barn? Do we just need to accept that we live in this entirely consumer-focused world, and that a vision like democratic equality or a vision of school, sort of solidarity vision of schools, that's in the past? Or do you think can we restore some bigger vision of public?
Yeah. Well, I'll be interested to hear what some of the students say to us afterwards, or maybe in the Q&A or at the reception, because I think my answer to that is, I don't think that the people who are sitting in this audience, at least those who are under the age of 25, I don't think they see it as a lost cause. I sometimes see it as a lost cause. I sometimes think, like, what are we doing? You and I have written 2 books about this. We've done 200 podcast episodes. It's like we've given however many public talks. And it feels like, a drop in the bucket at most. But I think I'm more hopeful when I imagine being 19 years old or 20 years old and having somebody name something for me that had been invisible to me previously. But once it has a name, suddenly I'm starting to see it everywhere, right? The water that we're swimming in has been made visible. And I have tremendous faith in the power of young people to shape the society that they live in. And I also have tremendous faith in their ability to see the world really clearly. I can feel myself getting more jaded the older I get. I can feel myself giving up on things. But I imagine that there are a lot of people in the audience who haven't yet given up on living in a fair world, right? Or on the idea of living in a functional democratic society. And so I guess the thing that I would name for those of you who may be more optimistic than we are, the thing that I would give voice to is that there are lots of things that public schools do. And all schools can do these things. But when we do them in public schools, we do them together. We make the decisions based on our collective interest and in terms of advancing the common good. You attend a public university right now, and that means something. And I'll just give you 3 aims. And these come from Emily and Andrew Penner and Thad Domina, who just wrote a great new book. And they label the aims of school this way. One is efficiency. So we've talked a little bit about efficiency. This is that social mobility piece. This is that social efficiency piece. Sorting people, preparing them for the economy, doing so in a way that produces return on investment for taxpayers. That's not very interesting. That's what you've been exposed to for your whole lives as the message about education. They've got 2 others, though. One is self-actualization. You matter. Each of you matters. In fact, everybody matters. And in our public education system, we've got 50 million students in K-12 schools and millions of students in higher education. And each of them matters just as much as every other one. That's something that public means, right? Public implies that. And self-actualization, this idea that each of you should be able to become the best version of yourself, the most you version of yourself, I think is one of the ways that we make the case for continuing to fund education in this country. Because I promise you, if it's not public, it's not for everyone. It will go away, and we are on the precipice of that right now. And if you want the right to pursue self-actualization in your education, I would hope that you want that for everybody, right? That's one of the reasons you're here, and you may not have named it, but you're feeling it in some of your classes. I know you are, right? A light gets turned on, you figure out what you're good at, you figure out what you care about, you figure out that you might make a difference in the world by pursuing a particular line of inquiry, or you figure out that you care more about the world because suddenly you know that there's a subject that you didn't know about before. So self-actualization should be on your radars, and then the other one should be solidarity, right? And this is a deeply public purpose of public education, both at the K-12 and higher education levels, right? Solidarity means that we recognize that all of us belong, that the person sitting to your left or to your right or behind you or in front of you has every much a right to be here as you do, right? And that's even truer at the K-12 level because we have a commitment in this country, and it's a promise that we make to every young person, and it's a promise that we have not always fulfilled and that I worry we won't always fulfill. And the promise is that every single young person will get an adequate and fairly equal education. Do we always get there? We don't, right? But we're certainly not going to get there if we forget that at the core of that promise is the idea of solidarity, is that idea that each of us matters as much as every other one of us, and that we are all in this together. And a part of the reason we find ourselves in this political moment when things seem so frightening, when things seem so on the edge of exploding, is that we have lost a sense of solidarity, and that we can build that back. We can build it back through our schools. And we need to remember that that's one of the core functions of education. When we look across our society, where are we building solidarity? Where do we interact with people across lines of difference, whether they be racial, ethnic, linguistic, or ideological, right? Where do we come together as a public? Where do we treat ourselves as a public? Where we don't have to pay a fee to be members, where we don't have to pass a particular kind of entry test, where we can't be excluded on arbitrary means, right? Where we come together and we recognize that each of us belongs as an equal member.
Well, I actually feel a lot better after that, Jack. What do you think? Should we take some questions?
Let's do it. Any questions? We got some time, I think.
We have one right back here. You go first, Dan.
Oh, good. Now we can see you.
So a couple weeks ago at the last colloquium, we had Dr. Cardona, the previous Department of Education head. He talked about building systems that last. However, right now, the system that he built is being dismantled because of the bureaucratic nature of the U.S. Can we fix the system for public education under the current form of our representative democratic republic or under our current mode of economic production?
Why don't you start us off?
Sure. That's a big question. I think that we are destined to lose the fight to preserve public education as we know it if those of us who are defending it defend the status quo. Right? I think that if we're put in a position where we say, no, what I want is the K-12 public education system that currently exists. I want Miguel Cardona's K-12 education system. I think there are too many people out there who can very reasonably say, but that system doesn't work great for me, right? I don't get heard in that system. My kid doesn't go to an equally funded school in that system, right? How is that working for me? I think instead what we need to do is we need to have a more ambitious collective imagination for what public education is and can be. So do I want Miguel Cardona's vision of education? I'll take that over the education debit card in Arizona 100 out of 100 times. But I know that there are people who would say, no, hell no. That's the system that we have had my entire life. It has not worked for me. It has not worked for people in my community. We attend segregated schools. Our schools are under-resourced. People from our community don't end up benefiting from those schools, right? There are other arguments to be made. Our schools are not democratically run. We don't have a say. The state has too much control. I think there are all kinds of critiques that can be reasonably mounted, and that the defense of education has to be more ambitious, has to be more hopeful than that, and has to begin with really kind of big, audacious swings that young people can take in terms of establishing a vision of what school is and should be, right? Why shouldn't school do everything that any of you in this audience can name, right? Why shouldn't you have just as much say in shaping that future as anybody in Washington, D.C., right? That's why I think public education can be both the fruitful end product of a successful democratic process and the thing that reminds us what democracy actually is. Democracy is not showing up once every 4 years to vote, right? Democracy is doing this messy work of figuring out, how do we want to live, right? What do we owe each other? What do we want? And that is the piece that I think begins to feel to me really exciting and possible. Like, let's name what we want. Let's stop moving so unconsciously through this system without recognizing that we actually are in charge of it, right? All apologies to Miguel Cardona, who I think is a wonderful man, right? He shouldn't have more power than anybody in this room, right? Collectively, everybody in this room should have a deep and important say in our public schools. Ask for it, demand it, right? I think that ultimately is so much more powerful than a vision of a privatized system in which each of us is a single consumer pursuing our own self-interest at the potential expense of everybody else.
The only thing I would add to that is that, one of the reasons that I spend so much of my time thinking about this stuff, writing about it, podcasting about it, is that for all the fighting that we do about our public schools, it's amazing when you get into a room with parents and community members who are politically really divided, and yet it turns out that they have remarkably similar visions for what they want their kids to have in terms of their education. And the answer is always that they want everything. And I feel like that's, like we're desperate right now for areas where we can bring people together across lines of disagreement and difference. And the fact that local education politics is often so at odds with the larger political trend, I view as really hopeful and a reason not to be so despairing. Like, I think Miguel Cardona is looking at the work that he did at this high level, but if you actually go and visit communities, it starts to look a little more hopeful. Thank you for that great question.
So we have time for one more question.
Oh, well, we used all the time. I can't believe it. It was all him.
So my question for the two of you would be, you've talked a lot about how the education system is failing and it's being done away with, and I completely agree with you. Are there specific policies that you guys think would fix this, or is it more sort of a nebulous, like, we know the problem but the solution is more hard to determine, or do you think there is a specific course of action to be taken?
So right now we're actually at a really clear crossroads, much more so than in the past. And so we can now look around at various states that have adopted a policy of what they call funding students, not systems. And so that means that I think in relatively short order, we're going to be able to start to assess the consequences. What does it look like when a state basically incentivizes people to leave the public system? What does it mean for the kids who are left in it? And so I think that that's going to mean for states that continue to be committed to public schools, that they're going to have to think about how to shore them up and to be a little bit more mindful of maybe Jack, I'm not going to let you sort of step in here because I'm thinking about we've spent so much time, your favorite expression is, like that so often we see that the Democrats built the runway and that opponents of public education just landed the plane on it. Yeah. And I think, like, in many ways, that's what we're looking at now. States are at a crossroads. Yeah. And those of us who believe in public education are going to have to really push policymakers to be mindful of the dangers.
Yeah, it's like you were reading my mind and seeing my thoughts. Yeah. Thanks for the opening, Jennifer. Yeah, I think that the core problem with regard to your question is that the choice that we have been given, and it hasn't been framed explicitly, is between a privatized system that will serve fewer and fewer students less and less equally, and that will ultimately undermine our ability to live together even further, or a system that is divorced from our actual needs, ambitions, and desires, and that advances a kind of neoliberal vision of school as a mechanism for producing return on investment for the state and the nation, where we emphasize standardized testing and career orientations. And I think the answer is none of the above, right? The answer is none of the above. The policy way out of this is policy informed by what ordinary Americans overwhelmingly desire, which is to create schools that are places of creativity and joy, that are places where young people feel safe and cared for, that are as diverse as possible, that have robust and rich curricular opportunities, but also extracurricular opportunities, that help young people figure out what they're good at, what they're interested in, and that expand their horizons for them, right? Everybody in this room at some point had a light turned on for them. You wouldn't be here if that wasn't the case. You may not remember a particular moment, but at some point, school mattered to you a lot. It mattered enough for you to stick with it, to make it all the way here, to be sitting in an honors colloquium. Right? School did something for you, and it can do that for everybody, and it should do that for everybody. And so I think the policy way forward is to think about what are the policy mechanisms that bring everybody into that same place, that turn the light on for everyone. And I think that's possible, right? It's possible to imagine a world in which every kid feels safe. I'm gonna cry. Every kid feels safe going to school, right? Where every kid feels like going to school is worth their time. Where every kid feels like what they're getting at school is just as good as what everybody else is getting. And to wind this all the way back to the consumer mentality that we were talking about earlier, right? If we are consumers, and if education is a private good, then somebody has to lose, right? Because if the game is about getting ahead, it's a zero-sum game. You only get ahead if somebody else falls behind. But if instead, this is about solidarity and self-actualization, if this is about democratic equality and building a better society in which we all belong, nobody has to lose. Everybody can win. Every school can be a quote-unquote good school. We can do that. That's totally achievable. And in terms of specific policies, let's talk while we eat appetizers. I've got some ideas. I think we're out of time.
Excellent. Yes, that was great. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give it up for Dr. Berkshire and Dr. Schneider. Thank you both very much. Thank you all for coming tonight, and we will see you next Tuesday night, 5:30 for Dr. Heather Schotten. Thank you very much. Enjoy your evening. Good job, guys. All right, good job. See you.